All right, let's dive into Genesis 21. It's this incredible ancient story that kicks off with just pure joy. A promise that's been decades in the making is finally fulfilled. But as we'll see, that amazing moment of triumph also lights the fuse on a really painful family crisis. And that brings up a fascinating question, right? What happens when the very thing you've been hoping and praying for finally shows up, but instead of bringing peace, it actually creates a whole new, deeply personal conflict? That's the real tension at the heart of this story. So let's set the scene. The story opens with something that feels like an absolute miracle. A promise made what feels like a lifetime ago is finally coming true. You gotta remember, Abraham and Sarah had been waiting for years. I mean, God had promised them a son, but they just kept getting older and older. And then, right on schedule, at the exact time God said it would happen, the promise is fulfilled. Their son, Isaac, is born. And just to let the scale of this miracle really sink in, look at this number. Abraham was 100 years old. 100! A man who's lived a century is suddenly a new father, and his wife, Sarah, was way past childbearing age too. By any normal human standard, this was absolutely impossible. Sarah's reaction is just pure, unadulterated joy. She says, "God has made me laugh." And in fact, the name Isaac is actually connected to the Hebrew word for laughter. This wasn't just a little chuckle. This was the sound of complete, almost disbelieving happiness after a whole lifetime of waiting. But that joyful laughter, well, it doesn't last long. The celebration of this amazing promise quickly takes a turn, and it sparks a really painful and divisive conflict right inside the family. So here's the flashpoint. They're having a big feast for little Isaac, who's probably just a toddler. And Sarah looks over and sees his older half-brother, Ishmael, mocking him. Now, Ishmael is a teenager at this point, so commentary on this suggests this wasn't just normal sibling rivalry. This was something much more serious brewing. And this really gets to the heart of the tension. You see, Isaac was the long-awaited son of the divine promise. But Ishmael, who was the son of Sarah's servant Hagar, he kind of represented Abraham and Sarah's own impatient attempt to make the promise happen on their own terms years earlier. As heirs, they just couldn't coexist.
Sarah's reaction is immediate, and it is harsh. She demands that Abraham get rid of Hagar and Ishmael. This isn't a suggestion, it's an ultimatum. And for Abraham, man, this is just devastating. Ishmael was his son too, and he loved him.
Right in the middle of Abraham's heartbreak, God steps in. He tells Abraham to listen to his wife, but he also gives him this incredibly important reassurance. He promises that Ishmael won't be forgotten. He too will become the father of a great nation. So this painful, awful separation wasn't going to be the end of Ishmael's story. And that one decision really splits the narrative in two. For Hagar and Ishmael, it kicks off a heart-wrenching exile. And for Abraham, it actually sets him up to solve a totally different kind of conflict through a formal agreement, a covenant. So Abraham obeys. The very next morning, he sends Hagar and his teenage son out into the huge, empty desert of Beersheba. And get this, he sends them with almost nothing, just a little bread and a single pouch of water. As you can imagine, it did not take long for that water to run out. This right here is the moment of absolute rock-bottom despair. Hagar puts her son under a bush, walks away so she doesn't have to watch him die, and just breaks down weeping. From any human point of view, their story's over.
But then, just when all hope seems lost, everything changes. God hears the boy crying, and an angel calls down from heaven straight to Hagar, saying, "Do not be afraid." It's this sudden, dramatic pivot from the very brink of death to a message of pure hope.
And here's the incredible part. God doesn't just magically create a well out of nowhere. The text says, He opened her eyes, and she saw a well that was there the whole time. The help she needed was right there, even in her deepest despair. She just couldn't see it. God was with them, even in the middle of the desert. Now, while Hagar and Ishmael are finding their life-saving well, Abraham is dealing with a conflict over a totally different well. He confronts a local king, Abimelec, because his men had stolen it. But notice the huge contrast here. This conflict isn't solved with exile, it's solved with diplomacy. They talk it out, swear an oath, exchange a gift, and they make a formal treaty at a place they name Beersheba, which means well of the oath. So what are we supposed to make of this really complex, emotional story? Well, let's unpack 3 key lessons that commentaries often pull from this chapter. First up, we discover something about the surprising, almost counterintuitive power that comes when you pray for your enemies. Now, this idea is echoed way later in the New Testament. You see, back in the previous chapter, Abraham had actually prayed for Abimelec, the same guy he's now making a treaty with. And the fascinating connection that's suggested here is what happened right after he prayed. Literally, right after Abraham prays for his rival's family to be healed, his own wife, Sarah, is finally able to have a child. The big takeaway here is that when you genuinely pray for the good of your enemies, not for yourself, but just out of mercy, you might just find those same kinds of blessings showing up in your own life. Okay, the second discovery, and I'll be honest, this one is a very difficult and challenging lesson on parenting. Now, one really challenging way to look at Abraham's actions is that he wasn't just being cruel. He was actually performing an act of radical faith. By sending Ishmael out with so little, he was basically forced to entrust his son's survival entirely to God. The lesson some draw from this is that sometimes the hardest but most loving thing a parent can do is to stop enabling destructive behavior and let their child face their own desert so they can finally learn to rely on God alone. And this all brings us to our third and final discovery, which kind of zooms out to look at Abraham's entire way of life. This idea of living like a nomad, like a foreigner in the world. You know, the chapter ends with Abraham planting a tree and worshiping God, all while he's still just a foreigner in the land. The book of Hebrews looks back on this later and points out that Abraham's entire life was defined by faith. He lived in tents. He never put down permanent roots because his eyes were fixed on a promise that was way bigger than any piece of land. And that really leaves us with one last question to think about. This ancient story is packed with promises, with conflict, with moments of total desperation. And so it asks us, when we're faced with our own deserts, deserts of family conflict or financial scarcity or just deep uncertainty about the future, where do we place our trust? In what we can see and control, or in a promise that's still just over the horizon?
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. So today, our mission is an immersion into Genesis chapter 21. We're drawing from a stack of commentaries that really zero in on what happens when God's promises finally collide with human consequences.
And this is one of the most structurally and I'd say emotionally complex narratives in the whole text. It really gives us 3 major pivot points in Abraham's life.
Right.
You've got the fulfillment of the covenant, then this heartbreaking family separation, and then a surprising payoff for, of all things, praying for your enemies. Our goal here is to extract that practical wisdom, the aha moments that apply to your life today.
And we're going to frame this whole thing with a piece of philosophy that comes directly from the source material, and it really sets the tone. It's this idea that meditating on profound truth makes you like a tree planted by streams of water.
That yields its fruit in its season.
Exactly, and its leaf doesn't fall, and everything he does shall prosper. It's a promise of stability, really. Stability and prosperity that are rooted in just careful study. If you plant yourself in knowledge, you'll bear fruit. And that idea, a tree thriving in the desert, is just the perfect metaphor for Abraham's world.
Absolutely. So the chapter opens with just pure triumph. The Lord keeps his word, does exactly what he promised to Sarah. She becomes pregnant, gives birth to Isaac in Abraham's old age. And the sources really emphasize this wasn't just some general miracle. It was delivered with this astonishing precision.
Just in the time that God said it would pass. That's the key phrase. God's fidelity to his timeline is a core theme here. And you have to think about the numbers. Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born.
100.
This was not a quick turnaround. I mean, they had lived with this unfulfilled promise for decades, just relying on faith.
And Sarah's reaction, it just encapsulates the whole moment. It even defines the name Isaac, which means laughter. She says, God made me laugh. All who hear what happened will laugh with me. It's an infectious joy. It really is. She's recognizing how impossible the whole situation was. She even says, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse a baby?
Nevertheless, I have given Abraham a son in his old age. It's just beautiful.
And it was a moment of public celebration. Huge vindication.
So when Isaac was about to be weaned, which was probably around age 3 in that culture, Abraham prepares this massive feast to celebrate. But, as is so often the case in these narratives,
Right, when you're celebrating.
a moment of triumph immediately precedes a moment of intense crisis.
And here's where the narrative just turns painful. At that feast, Sarah sees Ishmael, the son of Abraham and Hagar, her Egyptian servant, doing something she sees as, well, really dangerous. The sources say he was mocking or bullying his younger half-brother Isaac.
And that one observation, it leads to this explosive, extreme demand from Sarah to Abraham. She says, "Cast out that slave and her son. He shall not share the inheritance with my son Isaac."
That is just brutal. And we have to remember the context. Ishmael was, what, roughly 17 at this point? Yeah, about 17, while Isaac is just turning 3. Abraham had raised Ishmael for well over a decade.
Of course.
And the text makes it really clear. This request was greatly displeasing to Abraham. And why wouldn't it be? Yes, Ishmael was the product of Abraham's impatience, a mistake, but he was still Abraham's son. This is a devastating moment of paternal grief.
It seems like such an incredibly harsh directive, and yet God himself intervenes and tells Abraham to comply. How do the sources even justify that level of severity? God tells him, do not be distressed. Do everything Sarah tells you.
Well, the key, I think, lies in the clarification that comes right after. God reminds Abraham that the covenant, this world-altering promise, it has to proceed through Isaac. It's a necessary surgical separation. It's the difference between the son of the promise and the son of the flesh. The lineage that carries the divine covenant just cannot be compromised by the lineage born of human effort.
But the sources do make a point of emphasizing that Ishmael is not abandoned by God.
Not at all. God promises, I will also make a nation of the descendants of Hagar's son, because he also is your son. So Ishmael still gets a future, a blessing, just not that primary covenant blessing.
Which brings us back to that word mocking, because for an ancient audience, just that simple word, it just doesn't seem to be enough to justify banishing your 17-year-old son.
Exactly, and this is where the deeper technical commentary is so essential. The sources note that Jewish commentaries suggest the mocking could have been something far more corrosive than just sibling rivalry.
What are they suggesting?
They suggest it could have been, well, sexual perversion or even a deliberate attempt on Isaac's life through, dangerous games that were fueled by this intense jealousy.
Wow. Okay, that level of severity explains everything.
It does. It reframes it completely. It wasn't about property rights. It was about the purity and the survival of the covenant line. The commentators had to posit that this extreme moral corruption was there to justify why God would command it. It wasn't spite. It was a matter of spiritual survival.
That reframes the entire story, from family drama to divine necessity. But let's look at the provision, or really the lack of it. That morning, we see Abraham, a man of immense wealth, flocks, servants, gold. He gets up early, prepares some food, and hands Hagar a single container of water.
A single container.
And sends him away.
That detail is one of the most shocking parts of the chapter, and it's a cornerstone of the commentary we reviewed. For a man who could easily outfit a whole caravan, this minimal provision, it was an intentional act.
So is the text suggesting that faith requires us to look, well, irresponsible to the world? Because from the outside, Abraham's actions look negligent.
They do, but the commentary argues it's the opposite. It suggests that by offering minimal human aid, Abraham was entrusting them entirely to God's promise for Ishmael. He was actively relinquishing his own control and wealth.
So he couldn't be accused of helping God with his own money.
Precisely. It was a test of radical trust.
And that trust is immediately tested. Hagar is wandering aimlessly in the wilderness. The water runs out and crisis hits fast.
When the vessel's empty, she puts the boy under a bush, and then she intentionally moves away. She sits about 100 meters away, weeping, and she says, I do not want to watch the boy die. It's just this agonizing moment of defeat.
But the shift to divine intervention is immediate. And what's fascinating is who God hears. The text says God heard the boy crying.
Not the mother, the boy.
Yeah.
The angel of God calls out to Hagar, reassures her, tells her not to be afraid, and reaffirms that promise, I will make of his descendants a great nation.
And then comes the miracle. God opens her eyes and she sees a well full of water. She fills her container, gives the boy a drink.
And Ishmael not only survives, he thrives. He grows up, lives in the wilderness, becomes a skillful archer, and his mother arranges his marriage to an Egyptian woman.
This whole paradox, the rich man sending his son away with nothing, only for God to provide everything. This brings us to what the commentary calls discovery number 2, which is all about paternal lessons.
Right. The application for parents today is derived directly from this incredibly difficult choice Abraham made. The commentary asks you to consider the modern implications of this desert.
You mean if parents have raised scornful, cynical adolescents who abuse their affection, their resources?
The source suggests it may be time to implement a metaphorical desert. I mean, this is a deep point. It means you stop enabling the behavior. You stop providing for their flesh and their abuses.
That is a terrifying challenge.
It is. You have to make the painful choice to hand them over to God, trusting Him alone to manage their future without your human aid. Just like Abraham with that one water container. It's about trusting God to deal with the fruit of our own past errors.
Instead of trying to fix these deep-seated issues with money or more enabling. Wow. Okay, let's pivot now because the chapter shifts completely from that agonizing family drama to, well, hard-nosed international diplomacy.
Suddenly, Abimelec the king and his commander, Phicol, they show up to visit Abraham. And their motivation is just astonishingly transparent. Abimelec tells him directly, "It is obvious that God is with you, helping you in everything you do."
It's this incredible moment of recognition. Abraham's blessing is so evident that the local king wants a peace treaty. He asks Abraham to swear an oath by God that he'll never deceive him or his descendants.
And Abraham agrees. But this is where we need to pause and insert discovery number 1, the secret to receiving blessings, because it hinges entirely on Abraham's previous interaction with Abimelec.
Right, this is the connective tissue so many readers miss. In the chapter before this one, Abimelec had mistakenly taken Sarah, thinking she was Abraham's sister. He essentially becomes Abraham's enemy.
And God directed Abraham to pray for Abimelec.
And the result of that prayer was immediate. God healed the women of Abimelec's household who had become sterile because of Abimelec's sin.
Okay, now here's the profound aha moment from the commentators. Abraham's own wife, Sarah, was healed of her long-term sterility and was able to conceive Isaac after Abraham sincerely prayed for the sterility of the women of his enemy's people.
That correlation completely reframes everything we just read. The commentary is suggesting that Abraham's blessing Isaac was a direct result of his selfless act of interceding for his adversary.
Yes, and this current success with Abimelec is just the final payoff of that past mercy. The moral is crystal clear. When you sincerely pray for the welfare of those who have wronged you, God grants you the blessings you ask for them first.
It connects directly to the teaching from the New Testament. Love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you.
By doing that, you're acting as a true son of your Father in heaven, who gives sun and rain to the good and the bad. But the source material has a really important warning here.
About the prayer itself.
Exactly. It warns that the prayer must be pure and sincere. You can't do it just for personal convenience, hoping for a return. You have to do it out of a deep desire to be merciful. When that condition is met, the blessing you ask for others becomes your reward too.
That gives this whole negotiation with Abimelec a completely different feel. It's not just a land deal, it's a relationship built on this shared experience. But even with an oath, they still have a dispute to settle.
They do. Immediately after the oath, Abraham complains about a well that Abimelec's servants had forcibly seized. Abimelec claims he knew nothing about it, which suggests, some internal conflict in his own ranks.
So they have the treaty, but they have to resolve this critical water rights issue. Abraham gives him a gift of sheep and cattle, but then he sets aside 7 specific ewe-lambs.
And the significance of these 7 lambs is the key to the whole settlement. Abraham explains that they are a physical sign that Abimelec accepts that Abraham dug that well. It's a symbolic payment that forces Abimelec to publicly validate Abraham's right to that water source.
And this public act gives the place its name, Beersheba, which means well of the oath. It's a physical monument to their treaty.
Right. And Abraham's final act in the chapter is this simple, profound gesture. He plants a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there he worshiped the Lord, eternal God. Planting a tree, it signifies a long-term commitment, a hope for stability, even while he is living as this perpetual nomad.
Which brings us to our final reflections. We've seen God's fidelity to his timeline, the painful necessity of separating the son of the promise from the son of the flesh, and the power of interceding for those who've wronged us.
And the final provocative thought, discovery number 3, it loops right back to Abraham's character as a nomad. The commentators note that even after establishing a permanent well and planting a tree, he lived as a foreigner in his own promised land. It reflects that teaching that we are all just strangers living in tents in this world.
That mindset really is the ultimate test of faith. So for you, consider Abraham's choice to send Ishmael away with almost nothing. If you are struggling with a difficult outcome in your life right now, a complex relationship, a financial crisis, are you fully trusting God, even if it means deliberately stepping back and relinquishing your own human control? The challenge is this. Are you trying to use your own resources to help God achieve his promise, or are you embracing the life of a nomad, knowing that ultimately Everything and everyone belongs to the eternal God.